Hey gang, Neil here. Just a quick video today. I know with all the other videos I always say they're going to be quick, but then I end up starting to yammer on. There's a lot of information to cover, but today actually will be quick. I just want to go over very briefly to set up some of the videos I have in mind that are coming soon as far as applying the tools that we made to practical painting and situations, painting situations. Just want to get some concepts out of the way as far as application methods of the oil paint and blending directions, just in a very short video before we get into more complex subjects. So what we're going to be talking then quickly are the two application methods of oil paint, which are called mosaicing and couching, and the two blending directions, parallel and perpendicular. Very quick demo. It's obviously the application method, how I'm going to put the oil down in the future and how I'm going to blend it together. Very important. I'm going to be using it all the time. Just thought, you know what, I'll deal with it in its own separate little short video so you can focus on what I'm doing without applying it to some complex form, so you can at least get these concepts down before we get into advanced form modeling. So without further ado, switch to the canvas. So, as I said, the two application methods we're going to be dealing with, I'm going to be using at all times, are mosaic, or mosaicing, and couching. Mosaicing. Mosaicing, very simply, is when you're applying, in this case, let me go higher than that. You're not going to be able to see it on my canvas. When applying value, obviously at some point in time it's going to be color, but the principles apply the same. When applying value, mosaicing is when you keep those areas of value, those patches of value that you put down, when you keep them clean and independent of each other. You're going to butt them up against each other, but you're keeping the values separate. So I take, oh, that's a little dark. It's when I take one value, and butt it up against another value, so that they are clear and separate, like a tile floor, like a mosaic. In fact, I've seen some people call this tiling, where they're putting their patches of paint, butting them up against each other before they blend. So, mosaicing, butting your values up against each other, keeping them clean and independent before you blend. That's a mosaic. Now, once the mosaic is down, of course, we need to get the paint pulled together. So there are two, when you're mosaicing and go to blend, there are two basic directions for your blending. One is, change brushes here, parallel. Parallel blending is when you are pulling the paint in the direction of the paint patch, or the edge, when you're pulling in the direction of the edge. So parallel blending, right, take a dry brush, is when I am pulling the paint. Let me get a maul stick. Let me get a maul stick here so I can get a little control. Parallel blending is when I am pulling the paint back and forth in the direction of the paint edge. See, I'm periodically, actually can't see it. I thought you might be able to see it down here. If you see in the lower right-hand corner, I have my paper towel here. Could be a rag, whatever. I'm periodically cleaning the tip of the brush as I'm blending, so I diminish the amount of contamination of one value into another. So as I'm doing this, when you see the brush disappear, I'm going down here and not dipping into the spirits. I don't want to dip into the spirits because if I get some of the Gamsol on my brush, it's going to cut right through the paint. I'm just getting the excess wet paint off the tip of the brush on my, in this case, paper towel. So parallel, right? I've got my mosaic. I want to blend together to create a transition. Blending is all about creating transitions. The parallel blend is when I'm pulling back and forth in the direction of the paint edge. And you can probably see it creates a narrow band of transition, but it does create a transition. It creates a narrow band of transition between the lighter value and the darker value. Right? So it's creating a narrow band of transition right between the two patches. So I put in my mosaic, two values, butted them up against each other. Parallel blend is following the paint edge with my blending. So we have parallel, the other blending direction, another P, perpendicular. I'm not following the paint edge, I'm breaking the paint edge. So instead of parallel, we have perpendicular. I'm moving at a right angle to the edge. Perpendicular blending then is a much more aggressive blending. Again, I'm disappearing here so I can get some of the excess paint. There's a lot of contamination now. You notice I'm pulling light into the dark, but instead of following the paint edge, I'm moving at a right angle to the paint edge. Periodically getting the paint off. So I started first by pulling the lighter value into the darker. I don't want to start by pulling dark up into light. The contamination will really be severe, and it's always easier to darken a light than it is to lighten a dark. So if I pull the darker value up into the light, if I need to push that back down, it's going to take a lot more effort to get that lightened up again than it is to darken an area. So I pull the light down first, but again, I'm moving one patch of paint into the other, not just rubbing their edges together. I'm moving one patch into the other. Frequently cleaning off the tip of my brush. And if you're not noticing, I'm not zigzagging. I'm picking up and putting down, picking up and putting down like a series of strokes as I do this blending. Takes a little delicate work, a lot of frequent cleaning of the tip to get them blended together to the degree that I want. So, parallel, perpendicular. Obviously, the parallel, as I mentioned, creates a small band of transition. Perpendicular, much broader area of transition. So as we go, some of the projects that I'll be doing in the future, you'll see I do the perpendicular blend usually in the middle of the form when I'm trying to create a broad, smooth transition, but I'll do the parallel blend usually at the edge of the form where I want to hold the drawing, or I do it a lot between light and shadow, when light and shadow, where light and shadow meet. I'll do a lot of parallel blending because if I did the perpendicular, I would end up destroying or moving the shadow edge or the shadow boundary, the shadow shape. So the parallel blending is good for when you want to keep the drawing, tight. Perpendicular is good for when you're out in the middle of the form, broad forms, and you're trying to turn the form and create large gradations. Now, one thing to keep in mind with either one of these, if I don't get the amount of transition that I want with the blend, and of course blending, the reason why we use oils is because the blending is so much easier than acrylics, where you're working against the clock because the acrylic is drying quickly. The nice thing about oil, it stays open longer, you have plenty of time to do your blending. If I am not able to achieve the smoothness of the transition that I'm looking for with either the parallel or perpendicular, I can always go to my value scale and mix a value, or find a value, I should say, between the two areas that I blended, between the two values that I blended, I can find a value between them and drop it in to help bridge the transition that I don't receive, or that I didn't get in the amount that I wanted, or as smoothly as I wanted, with either of the blending methods. Oh, got a little bitty there. So, two application methods. Mosaic, right? Mosaic is where you're butting one patch of paint up against another before you blend them together. That's the mosaic. And to pull the mosaic together, those patches of paint, you have two blending directions, either parallel, parallel, which follows the paint edge, or perpendicular, which is at a right angle to the paint edge. Parallel blending gives you a smaller area of transition between the two values, in this case two values. The perpendicular gives a much broader transition. That is mosaic. The other is, let me raise this a little bit. So the one application method, mosaic. The other application method is couching or wet in wet painting. Couching, unlike mosaicing, where mosaic starts with multiple separate values, couching is where I start with one average value, whatever that may be. I'm starting in an area with one average value, in this case, eventually it'll be full color. One average value, and into that value, so unlike mosaic, where we're butting these values up against each other and then pulling them together, when you're couching, you start with one average value, and right into that, wet into wet, I am couching. I'm sitting one wet value into another to either lighten or darken it. Now, of course, the nice thing about couching is I don't have to worry about going in after the fact and blending afterward, because as soon as I mix wet paint into wet paint, it automatically starts to mix. So couching certainly makes the blending a lot easier. The problem with couching is, or at least the difficulty with couching is, as soon as I drop anything into that first mass of paint, it's going to start to alter what I put into it. So often I have to work up or down the value scale a little bit more and work the paint a little more thickly to get the value that I'm looking for. Since as soon as I put it down, whatever value I put into this wet mass is going to take on the qualities of that mass. It becomes particularly difficult when you're working in full color. It's one thing to try to create value changes with couching. That's one thing, just creating value changes. Keeping the paint clean, I should say, as you're doing this. Paint clean and consistent, getting the right values as they all mix together. It's one thing to do it with just value. It's a whole other level of difficulty to do it with color when you have hue, value, and chroma to deal with. And more often than not, in my experience as a teacher all these years, when people are couching with full color, that's when their color can very quickly degenerate into mud, where everything just mixes together. There's no difference but from one area of color to the next, because a person has not controlled the paint properly, and everything just mixes together into one soupy, nasty mess. So couching, starting with one average value, and then wet into wet into that value, in this case, value, not full color. You are dropping wet into wet, lighter and darker value changes. Work this just a little bit more so it's clear. So 2 application methods, mosaicing, couching, and at least for mosaicing, and it's not to say you can't do it with couching. 2 blending directions. Let's get that blended a little bit more. 2 blending directions are, sorry, that'll drive me crazy unless I get it out of there. I get a little bit of the dark paint mixing in where I don't want it to mix. 2 blending directions are parallel, following the edge of the paint, and perpendicular at a right angle to the edge. Parallel, smaller band of gradation, perpendicular, broader band of gradation. So, 2 application methods, mosaic, couch, 2 blending methods, parallel and perpendicular. I promised short, and I think today I actually delivered. But very important. Application methods and blending directions, you're going to use both through your entire painting career. Any project that you do, you're either putting paint patch down against paint patch or paint patch directly into paint patch and blending. So very important to get on the table, application methods and blending directions. Any questions? Don't hesitate to ask me in the comments section. If you like what you see, please like and subscribe. If you want to check out the school, I teach at the Carlin Academy of Fine Art. Check out the link in the web, the link in the comments section. And certainly, as I said, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. Thank you. Until next time.